So I want to start by calling your attention to the fact that there is a new Clerk of Session handbook that is up on the website. There are also other training slides and so forth there at this address. So if you go to the Presbytery's website, which is hudrivpres.org, and you move over to resources, and then from resources go to information and training for sessions, it's where you would have also found your minute review checklist as well, but that's where you will always find new information coming up for clerks of session. There are some basic training videos there for new clerks. There is this the handbook that has been updated to include things that have changed in the last year or two. And it goes through what should be in minutes, how to keep your records and review books, your rolls, what things have to go before the presbytery, et cetera. And let me just flag on page 10 of that is the actions that if your church is taking it must also be brought to another council, usually the presbytery. So this includes things that have come up in the past year from congregations that have asked me, do we have to, we're being given a piece of land or we're buying a piece of land. Do we have to come before the presbytery? The answer is yes. We're mortgaging a piece of land or we're taking out a loan. Do we have to get permission? Who do we have to get permission from? And it will either be the session and the presbytery or the congregation and the presbytery, depending on what you're doing. Leases of property for more than 5 years, or leases of property for purposes of worship, for instance, need to come before the presbytery, to the property committee in this case. And that means if you have a nesting congregation in your building, for instance, you should be getting permission from the presbytery for whatever lease you're giving that congregation. There's a longer list there. I just want to call your attention to it, page 10, because often clerks call me and say, I don't know, do I need permission or not? If you look at that page, you will find the list of what you do need permission for and what you don't need permission for. So please get a copy, download a copy of the Clerk of Session handbook and pay attention. I mean, I'd love you to pay attention to all of it, but because we get lots of questions on that chart, please notice that. So the first thing I want to talk about is religious corporation law. Susan Gardner, you have a question? You have to unmute.
Is that the one that we were given the link to and asked to look at? Okay, so there's nothing different.
No, that's the one I just.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So religious corporation law. I want to talk for a moment about that. You've got a series of emails from me over the last, if you were a clerk, over the last 6 months or so. Back in November, the New York State Legislature made some changes that for religious corporations, and every church is a religious corporation, all right, prevented churches from having hybrid meetings for religious corporation purposes. And so it's important to understand what part of your session meeting or what part of your congregational meeting would qualify as the religious corporation part. The basic answer for that is if it is either something dealing with property, so you're talking about buying a piece of property or mortgaging a piece of property or selling a piece of property, or if it's dealing with finances, you're talking about the budget of the church, for instance, or you're voting on a budget change, or you're electing officers of the corporation. Those are minimally the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. You have to have those 3 positions for New York State. Those are religious corporation actions. Anything else is not a religious corporation action, and you can have a hybrid meeting for it. All right. So if you're having a session meeting and you're not going to be voting on changing the budget, you're not going to be buying or selling or mortgaging a piece of land, and you're not electing officers, can you have a hybrid meeting where some of you are on Zoom and some of you are face-to-face? Absolutely. The minute, however, somebody says, I want to make a motion to change the budget that we passed, session, because session is the one that approves the budget, you've moved to religious corporation and you can't have a hybrid meeting at the moment. All right. If it's in your bylaws to allow for a hybrid meeting, and I would hope it is, don't take it out, because we're lucky enough that one of our congregations has an assemblyman who's a member of the congregation and has put before the assembly the change to allow hybrid meetings for churches. For not-for-profits and for businesses, it's already allowed, but they've put it before for religious corporations. It has passed the New York State Assembly, and it is now currently on its way to the New York State Senate. And I'm hoping that that will happen in the next month or two, and that then the governor will sign it and we will be allowed to do hybrid meetings again. You will notice, for instance, if you paid attention to the recent emails, that we're doing a face-to-face Presbytery meeting coming up next Saturday, right? It can't be a hybrid meeting. So we're offering people who can't come to RIDE to do the actual meeting an option of streaming it, but you can just watch it. We can't allow you to vote because of the current law. So right now, that's the same option for congregations. But as I said, I hope it will change. All right. But in the meanwhile, that you have to do it one way or the other if you're doing religious corporation business. If you're not, you're good for hybrid. Any questions on that? Susan Conrad.
So as long as you have a quorum in your face-to-face,
You're
it doesn't
good.
matter how many people are watching.
That's
So you just need to have a quorum in your face-to-face.
And you need to, when you record the vote for whatever the vote is that's religious corporation law, only count the number of people who are face-to-face.
Okay,
Or you
thank
could
you.
do the reverse. You could also only count the number of people who are on Zoom. And you could be saying that religious corporation is by virtual, right?
Okay.
As long as you have that provision in your bylaws. You just can't have both.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Gar?
Yeah, just to confirm, so if the meeting doesn't involve one of those three topics, then you can employ hybrid voting.
It can indeed. It can indeed.
Thank you.
Okay. Everybody got it? All right, good. And let's see. Before. Deb?
Right, you have a question from Duna in the chat?
Okay, Duna?
I'm sorry, what if everyone's Zooming?
If everyone is Zooming, it's fine. It's the combination that's the problem, if it's one of those three things. And Christy, I see your hand up as well.
Yes, thank you. A corporation meeting of the annual congregation, if the corporation is voting on the terms of call for the pastor, that would also have to be.
That's because it's budget.
It's budget.
Budget. So yes, it would have to be one or the other. Again, you can invite everybody for all the rest of that meeting to be hybrid. But when you move into the religious corporation piece, and technically, for instance, when you do that, either you should be running the meeting or somebody else should be running the meeting, right? The pastor or pastors in your case have stepped out from running that meeting. At that point, you either count the hands that are in the room or you count the hands that are on Zoom, but you don't count both if you're doing the meeting otherwise virtually.
Okay.
I know this is a pain, but hopefully we can get it corrected so that we don't have to jump through hoops that other not-for-profits and businesses don't have to jump through right now. Okay, Deb.
So one of the things that we've been saying back and forth a lot over the past 6 months to a year or so is a lot of these things seem as if they don't matter until they really matter. So it's these small things that can really trip you up months or even years, decades down the road. So it would be, it's these little details. And one of the things that I like to take every opportunity to bring up in front of folks that are leaders in the church, such as yourself, is the financial and the fiduciary responsibilities that we have in the church. Your session should be getting financial reports every month from your treasurer, from your financial person, however it is that you're structured to get those financial reports. But folks in the session should be reviewing your financial reports every single month. Every organization should be doing an annual audit. And I hope that you are. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I certainly hope that you are. I suspect it's in your bylaws. It should be in your bylaws. But one of the interesting twists that we've seen, and we've seen some issues over the past year, have to do with, Susan, we just lost the PowerPoint, just FYI. One of the things that we've seen is some congregations aren't doing an external financial audit. And a lot of times that's a problem with the expense of it, or just the awareness that something like this needs to be done. Can you raise your hand for me, hopefully electronically, or even wave at me and let me know if your congregation has an outside financial audit every 5 to 10 years. Right. So, oh, there's Gar. Okay, there's some. Here we go. We've got some folks that do that. Look at this. Oh, this is wonderful. My heart is singing. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. It is really important that you have your financial records reviewed by an outside organization at least every several years. The Presbytery has an outside audit done annually. And this is so important, I think, that we are going to be investigating the possibility of grants to assist with this. So I would like you to keep that in mind and the importance of doing that. Some financial records in congregations are a bit messed up, are in a bit of disarray. And a lot of this comes from the fact that we rely on volunteers, and volunteers turn over, except for about 2/3 of you who seem to be pretty steady for many, many years, but volunteers tend to turn over. And it would be in your best interest, for sure, in your congregation's best interest, to take a look at the possibility of having an outside financial audit done every few years. It does not have to be done annually, but certainly every few years. And one of the resources that you might want to visit, or that you might want for your session's consideration, is found right in your own denomination. And if you've ever visited the Presbyterian Foundation, that would be a resource for you in all financial considerations having to do with your congregation, certainly for the Presbytery. The website's easy. It's presbyterianfoundation.org. It's very simple to find. Many resources. We have in this area our own consultant who you will find on that website. And that person can provide you with a lot of direction as to the financial records and what you need or should do with your congregation and your session. It would be very helpful to you and to folks that come after you and sessions that come after you. If you take a look at your books, if you get them in order, and by the way, the Presbyterian Foundation also manages funds. So if you have some funds that you think might be called endowments, or think might just be investment funds, or just many funds that are sitting out there and no one's really sure what they're doing or who's managing them or how you're doing it, the foundation can help you with that. And they can help you get things in order. So we just like to throw this out there. Obviously, you are clerks of session. We have talked to the elders on the session as well, and we'll continue to talk to everyone that we can about the importance of having an outside person or an outside organization come in occasionally and take a look at your books for you and perform an audit for you. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay. Onward, Susan. We want to talk quickly. Oops, one too far, a bridge too far. We want to talk quickly about the session. Most folks on this Zoom today have different size sessions. And I just wanted to share with you Did you know that the average size of a session is 6? And I wonder how many people have 10 and 12 and 15 members on their session. I think that we need to take a look at the structure. All of our sessions are structured differently. I don't know what your manual says as far as how your session is structured, whether you have chairs of committees that sit on your session, or whether it's not chairs of committees, but it's visioning people that sit on your session along with financial people. There's a lot of different models that are out there. But one thing that we tend to do is we have very large sessions that were constituted many years ago that were probably adequate for our very large congregations at the time. I think occasionally we need to take another look at that. And we really want to say, how do we work efficiently? How is it that we would be tapping into leadership, but not scrambling every year to fill all these slots? How might we streamline the work of our session? That is up to you. That is up to the folks on your session and to your elders and leaders. So we just want to throw that idea out to you so that you can think about and talk with others around the size of your session and how it functions. Susan?
So if you have a session that is what Robert's rule says, less than a dozen people on it, if your board is less than a dozen or about a dozen, because Robert's rules actually says less than about a dozen. I don't know what that means. But if you're around a dozen or less, you can follow a different set of rules than the formal Robert's rules. You can do what's called the small group board option for how to run your session meeting. And what that means is, for instance, motions don't have to be seconded. You can have somebody just put a motion out there. Doesn't require a session at the meeting. You can have informal discussion on the topic when no motion is pending. So usually in a formal meeting, somebody has to put a motion and then we can discuss it. But for a small group, you can just begin to discuss the topic. Gee, we really want to talk about what we're doing as far as pastoral care, right? You don't have to have a motion. You can just chat about it and put it there instead. When a proposal is perfectly clear for everyone in the small board, a vote can be taken without a motion needing to formally be put. All right. The voting would normally still be the same, but it can be done by a show of hands if you want, if that's easier, especially on Zoom. For instance, if you're meeting that way, that's often easier than by a voice vote of everybody saying yes. So you've got several options here. And the other option, usually applicable for your pastor, is the chairperson, the moderator, who is a member of the session, is allowed to speak in informal discussion and vote on all questions, whereas normally the chair doesn't vote unless there's a tie. So you have this option and make session meetings a little less formal. In order to take that option, I've given you the section of Robert's rules where it's spelled out in more detail, but in order to take that option, you either have to vote it, you have to put it in your bylaws as an option, or you have to vote it once a year. Our session is going to follow this procedure. Or if you only want to put it in for one meeting or two meetings and give it a try, you can vote it at the beginning of that meeting. Tonight, we're going to operate under the small group board option. All those in favor, yes. All those opposed, and then you can continue with those options. All right, so something to keep in mind that will also help for more flexibility in the meeting than the more formal Robert's rules. The other thing I want to talk about is calling special session meetings. For several congregations, this has become an issue in the last year, and I want to make sure everybody is clear on how you do it and what has to happen and what can be a special session meeting. So first of all, a special session meeting is called by the moderator. So that's usually the pastor, or if you have more than one pastor, the senior pastor. If you have no pastor, but you have somebody who has been appointed by COM to be your moderator, that's who would call the meeting. It's not the clerk, it's not anybody else on the session. When the moderator thinks it's necessary, he or she may call the meeting, or when two members of the session notify the moderator that they want a meeting. They can't tell you. You're not the moderator. They have to contact the moderator of the session and say, we want a special session meeting. When they contact the moderator, they have to give a specific topic that they want that meeting for. That's why this is a special meeting versus a general stated session meeting. So you can only call it for topics. So it can't be general items. It has to be specific topics. It could be, what do we do about COVID protocols? That's been a common one where there've been special session meetings recently, right? What do we do about hiring a director of Christian education? That's a specific topic. You can't call and say, we want to call a special session meeting to deal with all the problems that have come up in the last month. All right. Or we've heard people are talking in the church. We want a special session meeting to talk about anything anybody's talking about in the church. It's too general. You have to have specific topics. And so when you write up, because although the moderator will be the one that will be told about the session meeting, you will be the one who will be actually probably sending out the notice of the session meeting. You must, for a special session meeting, specifically put what the topics are. Part of the reason for that is because people generally have stated meetings on their calendar, right? I know that I have the session meeting on the second Tuesday of the month, or the first Thursday of the month, or whatever it is. But you're now calling a meeting on another day, and people have to figure out, well, I normally go to this other meeting on that day, or I'm normally attending this Bible study on that day, or I'm not. Do they want to juggle their schedule to be there? Can they juggle their schedule? Is this so important to them? And so you need to tell them what that meeting is. That means reasonable notice has to be given, and with that topic as it's sent out. So you can't say, we're having a special session meeting today at 2 o'clock. That's not reasonable notice, right? If you call it's 11 o'clock, unless everybody is willing to waive reasonable notice. But you must notify everybody. For a special session meeting, it's the same quorum that you have to have. So for the average congregation, either your quorum is in your bylaws, or if it's not in your bylaws, it is half of your session plus one. All right, so you can have a much smaller session quorum than that. You could make, if let's say you have 6 people on your session, you could make your quorum the two session members plus the moderator. That would be fine. But your bylaws have to say that. Otherwise, you go by the quorum of Robert's rules, which is half plus 1. Questions on special session meetings or on small group options or size?
Susan, I think that's also a good point to remember, the quorum piece when you're dealing with the size of a session and how big it is. The bigger it is, the more people you need for a quorum.
Right. And it becomes, especially, I mean, in the last couple of years we've gone through, that becomes harder and harder to get. So again, a smaller session has more flexibility in that way as well. Okay, I don't see any hands up, so we'll go on to the next. Assuming my slide will go. I want to flag preservation of records for you. We've just exchanged minutes electronically. Should you have a hard copy? Several of you have contacted me, and the answer is absolutely yes. The denomination does not allow only digital. The digital is not good enough by itself. And part of the reason that the denomination has given is that programs change, that you're writing the actual minutes in. And so they're sometimes harder to authenticate as well. But basically, if you're writing in a program that was like, when I first started using a computer, I used WordStar, right, for my typing. It no longer exists anymore. If I had all those minutes only in WordStar, they would not be able to be accessed in any way. So you must have a hard copy as well. So what we checked when we did the minute review this past month was your digital, but please make sure that you have a hard copy. You have to do it on acid-free paper. That's not hard to find. Staples, something like 75 to 80% of paper in Staples, as an example, is acid-free. So it has to be an acid-free paper, and it can be in any other kind of sturdy binder. You do not have to use, do you know what I mean when I say those old Westminster binders? The brown, big, heavy binders that took special paper. Those people who said you can clerk for 10, 15 or more years will recognize these right away. That's no longer required. They're hard to, if you're typing minutes on a computer and trying to print on those on a computer printer, it's hard to get the paper to run. So you can use any acid-free paper and any sturdy binder. Vinyl binders are not great options because they're bad for long-term storage. They give off a gas and that degrades the records. So any other binder is absolutely fine, all right? It's important that you store those records somewhere that everybody is going to know where they are. The final minutes on the hard copy should be signed by you, and if sealed by the Presbytery. So I have gotten, I think so far, out of all the minutes that have been exchanged, maybe 8 to 10 of you have asked me to stamp your minutes. What you need to do is to take a picture of the last page, take a PDF of the last page or a picture of the last page, send it to me, I will stamp it and email it back to you. All right, and you can print it out for your book, but that should be there with my stamp and signature on it. So that tells you the minutes up to that date are approved. All right. So records in general should be kept in a binder. They should have numbered pages. If you start a new binder, you start new numbers, right? If you're going to put each year's records in a different binder, each year page 1 will be number 1. If you're going to keep the binder until it's filled, you keep numbering numerically until you can't put any more into that binder, and then you start over again with numbers. That's to prevent counterfeit pages from being added, from somebody changing the record later. Blank pages that are in there are marked either with an X or labeled intentionally blank, so that people don't think something is missing that should have been printed on those pages. And again, that prevents the counterfeit pages. Oh gee, somebody sees a blank page, let me add some minutes that weren't really there. And yes, I know none of you would do that, but we have had congregations that has happened, or where people have accused people of doing that. So make it easy by just putting an X through it or writing on the page. All right. What do you have to keep? We're doing this in the Presbytery. We're scanning, we're putting things online, and then we're sending things down to the Historical Society, which is happy to store them for any of us. So if you're having problems figuring out where to store your stuff, the Historical Society will take it. But they put out a guidelines for what you have to keep. And that includes records of employment records of various kinds. It includes the minutes, it includes roll books. They would love to get a whole series of different things. They don't care about, for instance, don't send them, if you're still doing old-fashioned financial records with a card for each person or anything like that, they don't care about that. But they love the other stuff. That if you have something of pictures of people for Easters, or pictures of people who are doing an unusual ceremony at your church, or they would love to have any of that stuff, as well as to have your records. So you can send down, if you prefer, your as long as you have an electronic copy of your minutes that you can access, you can send down your hard copy of your minutes to the Presbyterian Historical Society, for instance, and they will store it for you. And if you need something from it, they will then go through a search and look for it for you to find out what's there. Donna?
Yeah, just back to the numbering of the pages and the binders. I'm almost pretty sure I don't have it in front of me, but I feel like we continue on with our page numbering. So, like a year or so ago may have been like 1050, and now we're up to 2022 or whatever. So is that okay to just continue in that fashion?
Yeah, I guess it's okay. The reason to start over is it tells you that nothing has been added to a book. If you suddenly are handed a book and it says page 2341, I don't know if you're missing pages that were in that book, right? Or whether, because you don't have the other loose leaf with you. So that's where the question is. So the Historical Society suggests that you start each new binder with a number 1. But if you've been doing it the other way that's consistent, it's probably all right. Other questions on preservation of records?
I just say too that the Presbytery office is in the process of doing this, as Susan said. You know, where we are, we're subject to floods. And many records have been destroyed through the years with floods. And so we made it our business to make sure that it is digitized. The stuff that we need immediately is digitized. You know, some church records, very few, but pastor records, things like that. But we also sent down boxes and boxes and boxes of things to the Historical Society, who are extremely good at fulfilling requests for information. So if you need information that you've sent and that they have digitized down there, you need send an email to them and they get the information for you. So, you know, as these buildings age and as weather changes and floods happen, and, you know, what would happen if there was a fire in your building? Just another way of thinking of storage and of storage of things for long-term information is the use of the Historical Society. They've really stepped up lately because of what's going on across the country with, you know, the tornadoes and the hurricanes and the fires and everything that's been going on. They've really been stepping up and are very anxious to help you store your records.
And we have questions from Mariah first.
A question about the binders. Do you have any recommendation, because I don't know of any that are not vinyl, but maybe I'm not looking in the right place.
There are those that are not vinyl. I mean, yes, more binders are vinyl because that's what kids want for school, right? And because they wash off and all. But if you look, you should be able to, on Amazon. I don't want to advertise Amazon. I take that back. But
would it be like cardboard?
cardboard?
Or, you know, like paper?
Cardboard is okay. Usually, what you've gotten is a harder cardboard, right? Not a
Right.
corrugated. Yeah, that's
For those old blue ones, the old blue
Yeah.
binders,
Cloth.
the ones,
cloth.
cloth
Okay.
binders. Yeah.
Those
Okay,
are fine.
and for printing, is it preferred to do laser or inkjet? Do you know?
Inkjet is superior to laser printers.
Okay. Thank
So for long-term record keeping, it is. It may not be a superior printer for actual printing, but for long-term, inkjet is better. And Janine, you have a question?
Yes. Going through our records, we have, I think, going back currently to prior to 1920. And these records, these session minute books are all kept in a fireproof cabinet, but it's getting out of control. It's just getting too many books. Is this something that we need to copy and send down to the Historical Society?
I mean, if you're sending it, you know, and you can either drive it down or you can pack it up and send it down by mail to them, and
Right.
they will keep record. They'll keep it. They keep a hard copy and they digitize it so they can scan it. And the advantage is that, well, like if you or I digitize it right now, we're digitizing it in whatever the format is that we're used to now, right? They keep updating their digitizing, so that if once upon a time we would have digitized to a CD, or we would have digitized before that to like an 8-track, or you know what I'm talking about. We have
Microfiche.
and we no longer have microfiche readers, most of us, for instance, right? They update it so that it's always in a form that's accessible. So that's the other.
They handle the copying of that information from the books?
They keep it for themselves that way. If you want to actually get a copy, then you have to pay them per. Deb, do you remember page? Is it?
Well, yeah, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to digitize it for yourself, it's more it's more economical to probably do it yourself, to scan it and keep it. But you don't have to do that. You'll send it down there, and apparently there are tunnels throughout this nation that contain vast quantities of paper materials from various companies and all of us. So they will store the paper however they do that, but they will also digitize it. So when Janine calls down there and says, I'm from New Hempstead and we are trying to sell a piece of property that they tell us that we bought in 1950. And we know you have our record, our minutes from 1950, our records from 1950. And they say, okay, we'll get back to you. And they scan it. They search it. They can put in very easily. Their whole system is searchable, and they can put in the name of your congregation, and anything that they have that has to do with your congregation will come to you. So think of them as a big giant file cabinet.
Right. But I was just wondering because, I mean, we've been there since 1736 or whatever, and I've only found books through 1920. Like, do I assume all those past session minutes are down there?
You could ask them.
You could ask. It'd be interesting to ask. Yeah.
Because I wanted to see what they did for the pandemic back in 1918, and we didn't have it. So
that was a popular request. That was around what the sermon was, or what kind of information that folks were trying to get around that pandemic back then.
Right.
You should reach out and just say, hey, I'm the clerk, and I was just curious as to what we have, and they'll tell you. They'll tell you what records that they have down there. More than likely, if you search the fourth closet in the 7th Sunday school room, there's going to be boxes up in the top of the loft, and there's going to have some old yellowed papers in there that's going to say 1820 minutes or something like that.
Right. No, I will. I'll contact them and ask them what they've got.
Really, especially now when you're keeping an electronic copy, there's no reason for you to hold on to that hard copy, right?
Right.
Whatsoever. Space is a premium for most of us, and so why hold on to it in files?
Yeah,
Lori,
I was just concerned about I mean, prior to just, I don't know, the 1980s or 70s, everything was handwritten.
Yep.
So, I didn't know if I'm supposed to copy those or just let them deal with it.
If you find all that old stuff, send it down there, because they know how to handle that kind of thing. They really do well with that.
I'll contact them to see what info they need from me.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Lori Ransom.
I just wanted to share that we sent our 1865 register down to the Historical Society, plus over 50 years of minutes. And it was absolutely wonderful. They digitized everything for us for a very little amount of money and sent it all back. And it's been wonderful. They tell us exactly where everything is stored. They give you the drawer it's in. So it's really, and it's very economical considering the service you're getting.
And Lori, in what format did you get it back?
Okay, I got it back on flash drives.
Okay.
About 2 years ago, we sent the information down.
That's fantastic to know. Thank you.
And again, that's only if you want it back in electronic format that you'll have to pay. Otherwise, they just store it. That's part of what they do. So, and they will search it for you without charging you anything. Martha from Katona.
I thought when I read this the other day, when you sent it out, that it said that inkjet printers, if they got wet, the ink ran. And so it seemed like they said to do it laser and keep it in laser.
For a long-term, inkjet are better than laser. For weather issues, laser are better than inkjet. So what I'm suggesting is if you're going to send it down to the Historical Society, where they're going to store it in a place that's not going to have weather issues. It's all, they run the humidifiers and dehumidifiers and so forth. Then inkjet printers are the better bet. If you were storing it in, when we first moved to our current offices, it was stored in lower, we had stuff stored in lower files that flood. That you might want a laser printout copy as well, because yes, then the inkjet will blur. But what we're trying to encourage you all to do is to send it where it's completely safe, rather than keeping it in any format in your building.
Thanks for explaining that.
Yeah. Any other questions on that? Okay, then what we're going to move on to then is to talking about the basic obligations and the basic responsibilities of a clerk of session. If you are a longtime clerk of session and you know how to do minutes and you know what your annual responsibilities are and you know how to set up a session meeting and so forth, you're more than welcome to leave at this point, because we're going to do really basic clerk training. If you'd like to stay, even if you've been a clerk for 50 years, you're welcome to stay, but you're not obligated to at this point. This is for those of you who have been clerk for, last year we did rolls and registers in this part. Now we're going to do minutes and annual responsibilities and so forth. So you're welcome to stay, you're welcome to leave at this point. So we're going to start by talking about, these are your responsibilities regularly, and usually this is monthly if you have a monthly session meeting. You need to send meeting notices. That can be by mail or snail mail or email, depending on your congregation, whatever will get the notice to your congregation. You need to contact committees about what business, if you have committees in your congregation, about what business they need to bring to the session each month, or each meeting if you have it not monthly. You need to ask them for any recommendations that they have in writing so that people know what are coming ahead of time. These recommendations, these 5 recommendations, will be before the session when we meet tonight. You work with the moderator, again, normally the senior pastor, or if you don't have a pastor, the COM appointed moderator, to develop the meeting agenda, right? As part of that meeting agenda, you should put consent agenda items. What are consent agenda items? They're items that are not going to be controversial, right? That, for instance, for most congregations, not all, but for most, minutes from the previous meeting are not controversial. When I send out minutes, for instance, for our Presbytery's council meeting, I send them out and I say, if you have any changes that you think are needed, let me know ahead of time. Get back to me. And then when I send out the final copy of the minutes, I consent agenda it, right? Because, and we do this for the Presbytery meeting as well, because nobody has any other changes. It should just go through. So consent agenda items are things that can go through pretty easily. This will save a lot of time on your session. It will be freeing for time for what are larger items that really do need discussion. So reports from committees don't generally need to be voted on one by one. They can be consent agenda. Approval of minutes, motions from subcommittees that aren't going to need discussion. None of those things need to be voted on one by one. Consent agenda item. You can do that in one of several ways. At the top of your agenda, you can say items for consent agenda and put it at the top. Or the way we do it, for instance, for Presbytery meetings, is we put a little C next to the item and we put it in a different color ink. So in our case, we use blue. And so you can go through all the papers and see all of the consent agenda items that are there that will be treated in that way. If somebody wants to pull something from a consent agenda, they can. It's as simple as, we're getting ready to vote the consent agenda. Does anybody want to remove anything from it? And if one person on your session wants to remove something, you remove it. And then it goes back on the regular agenda for vote and discussion and vote. But otherwise, you've dealt with a huge amount of pieces of business that you don't have to worry about by consent agenda. I say that because when I looked at the minutes, a lot of people are not using consent agenda items from minutes that you've exchanged recently. So I want to encourage you to do that. You'll find it really helpful. Mariah.
Sorry, does that consent agenda then need to be in the binder with the minutes so that,
It actually gets, you still, as the clerk, still report it as actions taken at that meeting.
okay,
So there's still, if you're doing the more formal Robert's rules, they're still moved, seconded, and approved. And they show up just as something you've discussed, or if you're doing informal ones, you know, there was a motion to approve the following. So they're still in there each month, but you don't have to discuss them. You still have to put them in the meeting. Your next obligation as a clerk is to record the minutes of each meeting. That may seem obvious, but it's helpful to have a template with room to take notes if you're on your computer. I start with the minutes from the previous meeting and work with that template, filling in instead minutes for the month's meeting that we're currently having in that way. The minutes are to be a full and accurate proceeding of what happened at the session. And we'll come back and talk about what that means as far as motions and so forth. You're also supposed to keep the role of session membership and attendance. That means who attended, who was excused, who was absent, right? That's part of what you're supposed to do. And the session provides by rule for the number present for a quorum. You need to make sure as clerk that you have a quorum there. Your job as clerk is to bring all official correspondence to the session, to their attendance, to their attention. So you get a letter from a neighboring congregation saying, would you participate in this with us? You need to bring that to the session so they can decide. You get a letter from the chair, the moderator of the Board of Deacons that says, we've visited these following people and we've used up our budget as deacons. We need more money to do more pastoral visiting and bring flowers and so forth. That is a letter that comes to you that you bring to the session. You get a note from me saying, gee, we've noticed that you haven't had a ruling elder in attendance for the last 6 session meetings, presbytery meetings. You bring that to the session. That's part of your role as the clerk of session, is to bring that correspondence to the session and to respond afterwards. So you get the note from me saying you haven't had anybody at presbytery meetings and you elect somebody, and you write back to me and say, thank you for that. We loved getting your note. It was just wonderful. And we've now elected somebody. Here's our representative, all right? Or to the neighboring congregation that wants you to participate with them. That's your role to do. It's not the pastor's role. It's your role to do. You also are the one who is responsible for keeping a list of unfinished business. Often we have a longer agenda than we can get through in a session meeting, especially if some of it is highly controversial. And so you need to make sure, well, we didn't get to this or this or this, it rolls over to the next meeting if it's been part of your agenda. Or somebody says, well, let's visit that again in 4 months. You need to make sure you're the one that's responsible for making sure they visit it again in 4 months. So any unfinished business, including business referred to a committee, including business referred to a staff member that needs to come back at some point later. So your office manager is asked to do the following and report back to you. You're the one to coordinate making sure it comes back to the session, all right? And in a lot of congregations, you need to prepare some kind of informational thing that would go out to the congregation. It's really important for sessions to be transparent with congregations. And so something should either go in your newsletter or go in the old days where we always were face-to-face. It went out for some congregations on bulletin boards, but somehow you need to be letting the congregation know what you're doing. And again, normally that's the clerk of session that will provide that kind of information. You can do it in consultation if you want with the moderator. You can also, I mean, you can put in your congregational newsletter, do a separate email, whatever works. That should not include confidential matters. Please do not send that out, right? If you're dealing with the fact that you think the sexton is not cleaning half of the building that you have, or the cleaning company that you have, that's not something that needs to go out to the congregation, right? You're trying to make sure the congregation knows that in general, here are the things the session is working on. That's part of your monthly obligation. Questions on monthly? Okay, then annually. You need to annually complete the statistical report by the deadline that's given. I will say one more time, because every year, no matter how many times I say it, I get this question. Some people will say to me, I just need another week. We didn't get to it. It's not my deadline. When I notify you that it's time for the annual report, the denomination sets a deadline. I give you to the last day of that deadline. After that, I can't give you any more time. It's the denomination, they won't take it. And you're putting it in their database. So part of it is usually, I can tell you by December when the deadline will be, and you usually have till sometime in early February, right? Unfortunately, that's often in between clerks. And so one clerk will often go off at the end of December or early January, and another clerk come on. You need to, if you're the current clerk, make sure the new clerk knows where things stand as far as the annual statistical report. All right. You normally will also get a link yourself to the clerk's annual questionnaire. That comes from Louisville. I don't see it anymore. They've changed how they do it. And it usually comes out toward the end of the year. And it's a completely different report than the annual statistical report. They cover some of the same ground, but the denomination uses it in a different way. We don't in the Presbytery track that annual clerk's questionnaire. That's between you and the denomination. All right, so because we don't see it, we have no way to know if you filled it out or not. But they really would like that. So once a year, we would ask you to do that. Often I will ask you for other paperwork, or Jean Kaiser, our office manager, will. For instance, if you've changed the pastor's compensation or not, we will ask you once a year to send in a form with any changes, or to alert us that there are no changes. That's paperwork that comes from you as clerk of session. Church information forms also, if you're looking for a pastor, would come from you as clerk of session normally. I wish this had a different title. This is our denomination's title. Once a year, we do a necrology. It's a list of ruling elders who have passed away in your church in the last year. It's usually read at a spring meeting of the Presbytery. It's not only of people who are current ruling elders. It asks you to go through your rolls and registers. If somebody has died and they have ever in their life been a ruling elder, you need to submit their names to us. They may never have been a ruling elder in your church. They may have been a ruling elder in a whole entire different presbytery in a different part of the country. But if they were a ruling elder, when they transfer their membership to your congregation, hopefully the congregation that they transferred from, when they sent their letter of transfer, said, and so-and-so has been a ruling elder twice, or a deacon, or you need to then report them in the necrology, all right, that comes in each year. So ruling elders who have passed away in that year. The review of what we just finished this past week, right? The review of your previous year's session minutes. We will from now on always be exchanging them electronically, so you can just know that and get them ready ahead of time. And every year they will come up and they will be at about the same time. So I try to give you a few months in the current year to get the previous years ready and to read with each other and so forth. But every year that will come up and be read in that way. And then your other obligation annually is to make sure that you let your congregation, your session especially, but congregation, know of when Presbytery meetings are happening, so that you can elect a ruling elder commissioner to the Presbytery meeting. So those are your annual obligations that are time bound. All of those are time bound. I should also say, in order to qualify for a legacy grant, those are grants that we're very happy to give for projects that congregations are doing that can be up to $150,000 over 3 years that you can get for mission projects, ministry, you're doing creative new things. You must every year submit your statistical report and your minute review in order to be able to get those funds. So if you're currently getting funds in that way, you need to make sure you keep them up or we can't give you the next year's funds. And if you are thinking about applying for a grant in that way, you need to make sure both of those are in. Now, this year, every one of our congregations submitted an annual statistical report, every single one. And I think we have all but 5 of the congregations who have their minutes reviewed. So most of you, it won't be an issue. But if in the future, you just need to make sure if you're thinking or if you have a legacy grant, that is the case. Questions on annual? Okay, then session minutes. I should say you're also responsible. Christy, you're muted.
I had a question about keeping records of elders and deacons. The way in which we have been recording elders and deacons is we have been faithfully recording all of them, their terms of call for our own, but we have not necessarily been recording, at least in the same register, people who came to our church who had a history of being a ruling elder or a deacon.
Good.
And we need to begin doing that as people join our church who have, okay, we have to figure out how to do that.
Usually if you, in the old roll and register book, I would hope by now most people have their rolls and registers electronically as well, but assuming you're using the old one.
We're using the old ones.
Using the old one, then you would just also put down the years they were there, or if you don't have the years, but you've been told they were ruling elder at First Presbyterian Church in Norwalk, Connecticut.
Okay.
So you know when they came in, when you record their transfer, that's who they are.
Yeah. Yeah, because yeah, and we can turn around and add that to our electronic database, which will be even better.
Right. Because remember, once you're ordained as a ruling elder, you are a ruling elder for life. And so let's say that person 10 years after they join your church decides they want to be, or they're invited to become a ruling elder and they're elected.
Yeah.
You don't reordain them, you're just installing them. And so you need to have that record for that reason as well.
Okay. I have a roles question, but maybe we're not going to get back to roles and baptisms, and I can ask you at another time.
If you want to ask it, I'm going to do very quickly in about 2 minutes, telling you what the roles are before we do session minutes. So you can ask at that point. Okay?
Yep.
Jerry, you have a question? You're muted. Still muted.
Okay, sorry. Basically, same thing. I had a question about the roles.
Okay, so let me tell you about roles in general, and then I'll take both of your questions. The main thing that a clerk of session is responsible for, other than minutes, is to preserve the rolls and registers, to keep them updated, and those include categories. So you have a baptized member roll, an active member roll, an affiliate member roll. Those are your required roles, all right? You can have other roles of membership. You can create categories of membership beyond that. The Book of Order actually now, under the no longer new form of government, allows you to create other categories. That's up to you, how you use that. So baptized members are people who have been obviously baptized in your church, but have not more formally joined their membership. They've not been confirmed, or they've not come in by transfer of membership and so forth. They were baptized probably as children in your church, but they've not taken that next step. Active membership are people who have either come in by reaffirmation of faith, letter of transfer, etc., confirmation, right? They would move to that role. And then affiliate members are people whose membership is in one church, their formal membership, but who are going to be in your area for a period of time. And so they want to become an affiliate member for that period of time. So they're, it's a much more unusual category. I had, for instance, in my last congregation, we had a woman who had gone down to Louisville to work for the denomination. And first was an active member. She'd been our clerk of session for a while. She was an active member of our congregation and an affiliate in one of the congregations down in Louisville. And then over the years, Evelyn switched, so she became an active member in Louisville, but an affiliate member in our congregation. So when she came, because her family was still living up in Hastings. And so when she came back, she was worship with them and was an affiliate member. There are very few people in those categories. Most people don't know it exists. They don't ask to be affiliate members. And so you may have a completely blank roll on that page. But you should have people in baptized membership and active membership. So now, let's see, Christy, you had a question on this, and then Jerry, you had a question.
Yes, it's about, it's under baptized members. So I just want to make sure I understand this. So we have, let's say, a couple that comes into our church, and they've been worshiping with us for a while, but they've so far not joined a new member class. However, they have 2 young children, and we learned that their children were baptized in their previous church. So my understanding of who we are supposed to put on our rolls of baptism is that those children should be entered into our baptism rolls. No, thank you. Yes, that's what I want. I'm reading this.
Not baptize them, so they're in a role somewhere else.
Okay.
As
Yeah.
Baptized role.
Yeah.
When the family transferred, the congregation that sent the letter of transfer should have also said these children have been baptized, so you know, and you should keep track of it somewhere, because you're going to want to, let's say they hit confirmation age, you're
Right.
going to know that they've already been baptized, so you can confirm them.
Yes.
But you do not have to add children and children who are baptized elsewhere to your baptized member rolls.
Thank you.
Gary, question?
If somebody comes from a different background or whatever, another church, and they are baptized, do they go into the baptized role?
If are they joining your church?
We're in the process of joining them. Yeah.
They do not need to go into the baptized role. They would go when they join. They will join your active membership.
Okay, but if say
membership, you will either have them transfer, and that transfer can be from a Presbyterian church, or it can be from a Catholic church, or it can be transfer. They're going to get a formal letter, or you can have them reaffirm their faith. Those are the most common 2, right? And they can stand up and answer questions during worship that reaffirm their faith. Or if they've never been a member of any church, then we've got a third option for them, affirmation of faith. But you can have them do either of those, whichever they prefer.
So say somebody was
not on your rolls at all until they've done one of them, because they're still on the rolls of another congregation somewhere, right? So if they were, for instance, they were members of Sacred Heart Roman Catholic Church, right? They're on Sacred Heart's rolls until you ask them to either do transfer of membership,
okay.
or until they've reaffirmed. And so you can't have somebody on 2 rolls.
Okay. Now, if
I don't feel well.
the
Jerry,
digital,
I don't feel
Right.
well.
excuse me.
All right, we'll come back to Jerry's question in a minute. So I want to look at session minutes. We have some general guidelines that Robert's Rules gives us and that the Book of Order gives us for what goes into them. As I said, it helps to write out an outline ahead of time, so you know what you're supposed to put in, and usually as well to keep a copy of the minutes review sheet with you. Therefore, you can check off, okay, we've done our annual this, we've done that, you've got this. That will make your life much easier. The Book of Order requires that every meeting be begun and ended with prayer. That should be recorded in your minutes. And you can either just say the meeting was open with prayer, or the meeting was open with prayer by ruling elder so-and-so, or the meeting was open with prayer by ruling elder so-and-so who had us recite the Lord's Prayer together, or, you can make it simple or longer, but it should be in there one way or another. Then you also have to do basic locating information on each set of minutes. So where was the meeting? The meeting occurred by Zoom, or the meeting occurred in the church, or the meeting occurred at the fire station, or whatever it is. You need the date and the time the meeting began, the type of meeting it is. Is it a called meeting or is it a special meeting? The name of the moderator and the clerk should be somewhere in the minutes, and the time you adjourned as well as when you began. Right, so basic locating information so people know when the meeting happened. You need to make sure you have the moderator set. You cannot have a session meeting without a moderator. All right, so that's normally the installed pastor. If the installed pastor can't be there, they can invite another minister member of the presbytery to serve in place of that, of him or her. If you don't have an installed pastor at all, you can have COM appoint an installed pastor, right? I should say, Deb and I can both go in to moderate any session meeting or congregational meeting without special appointment. So if you need to have a session meeting at the last minute and you need a moderator, you call Deb. Question.
Excuse me?
I was checking to see if you were listening.
I'm listening, all right. But
So-
yes, reach out to us and we will help.
Reach out to us. Susan, you have a question?
Yes, I've been using a template that our church has used, I think, for a long time. And my name as clerk only appears at the bottom when I sign them. Does it need to be somewhere else?
That's okay, as long as somewhere in the
At the
minutes, we
bottom?
have both of
Okay.
those. So for
Okay.
your average session meeting, remember, you don't, unless you're having a special moderator, you don't need to have the moderator sign every session meeting. You need to have,
Right.
but if the moderator's name needs to be somewhere. Your
Yes.
name, if you're signing at the bottom, will say
Yes.
who's doing the minutes. That's just
Yeah,
fine.
the moderator is always at the top, but
Right.
I sign at the bottom. Yep.
That's completely fine. Attendance, who's there?
Susan,
Yes.
Susan, you have a
Yes.
question in the chat from Joyce. What's the difference between a called and a special meeting?
So the special meeting is what I went over before, where you're having either two ruling elders or the moderator call a meeting for one specific purpose that you've sent out. Your regular monthly meetings or your regular quarterly meetings or whatever they are that are at the same time each month, are your regular stated meetings. Those are ones that people know about ahead of time.
So you're using called and special together, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So attendance, you need to include guests. If people come to your meeting and they're speaking, for instance, or they're there, you need to make clear who the guests are in your attendance, as well as your session members. You need to make clear that there's a quorum. Your job as clerk is to declare we have a quorum. It means you need to know what the quorum is for your session, right? Your minutes should show the approval of the agenda, the approval of any minutes from previous meetings. If your minutes are corrected, somebody said, no, we didn't close it, and we do have congregations that do this. We didn't close at 2:07 p.m. We closed at 2:09 p.m. I looked at my watch. All right, and so you need to change it to 2:09 to get the vote. You need to show in your current minutes that change. You don't change the previous minutes, right? You note that they were corrected. All right, don't include the changes, just note that the minutes are corrected. Next, you record actions, but not discussions. This is not a transcript. A transcript is a really bad idea for a whole series of reasons. People then get to argue, I didn't say want, I said prefer, right? If you're doing a transcript. And legally, it's not a great idea. So you do not want a transcript. You want actions, is what you're recording. That's much more important to do. You're not going to editorialize, all right, as you record the actions. You record the final wordings of main motions and what happened to them. Often, for instance, when we have a motion and I'm taking minutes, I will say, let me repeat the motion to make sure I have it the way you're going to vote on it. And I read the motion as it's going to be in my minutes before people vote. That's the final wording of the motion. And you put those in no matter what happens with them. If the motion doesn't pass, it fails, it still goes into your minutes. If the motion is tabled to come back some other time, it still goes into your minutes. If the motion passes, it goes into your minutes. So if it gets appealed, it goes into your minutes. If you're voting by ballot, then you record the number of votes for and against. If somebody has asked for a ballot vote. If you're voting by hand or by voice vote, you don't need to record that. Okay. When you record the motions, anybody who votes against a motion that passes has a right, if they choose, to have their name recorded as opposing that motion, as dissenting. So if they ask for that, and normally before we had Zoom meetings, the answer was if they asked for it before you all left the room where you're meeting, it had to be recorded. With Zoom calls, it's a little harder because people may want to, they can't walk out with you and say, I want this recorded, right? So if they, within a timely manner, ask to have their dissent recorded, you need to put it into the motion, where the motion is. So-and-so dissented from this motion, right? So you're going to summarize oral reports. There was a report from the Christian Education Committee. There was a report from the Worship Committee. You don't need to go into great detail. You can, depending on your congregation, attach the written reports if you want. Some of your congregations, I know, remember again from this past month, some of your congregations have lots of attachments with all of the written reports that were given to a session. Some of them don't include the attachments. They're just summarized in the minutes themselves. Either is okay. All right. But you either way, you need to give a summary at least of what's happening. All right. And some of those written reports are going to be in more detail. So if you're doing the serving of communion, for instance, you need to put that in as part of the summary of the oral reports, as well as your own clerk correspondence, any baptisms, communions, marriages, any other changes in membership. Somebody has moved from the baptism roll to the active roll because they were confirmed. All those things go in. Then you have special reports that can also either be attached or can be summarized. The treasurer gave a report and said that our investments are down 5% because of the stock market, right? You can do that. Or you can put in the attachment if they're giving a written report, just treasurer's report, see attached. Your choice. Either's fine. Same thing with the pastor's report. Some pastors give an oral report. Some pastors give a written report. You can choose if you have a written report to have it attached, or you can try to summarize the highlights of the pastor's report if it's oral. You do not put everything the pastor says in. Obviously, if the pastor is telling you confidentially that they visited this person because there's this kind of problem, that doesn't go in your minutes. The pastor reported on pastoral visiting, right? Committees and commissions, the same thing. It's your choice. Do not summarize the remarks of a guest speaker. All right, they're a guest speaker. They're not going to act. You can say a presentation was given on Habitat for Humanity, but you're not going to go into great detail on what they said. If you all acted on it as a follow-up, something as a follow-up to it, what you all did will go in, the motions that you made will go into the minutes, but not the details from the speaker. For property, if you're selling or buying or encumbering property, you need to include the name, the address, and the legal description of the property that you acted on. if you're selling it or leasing it, a buyer or the leasee, the sales price or the terms of the lease, the loan amounts or terms, and you need to show when the concurrence of the presbytery was given if it's required. So you're having a local AA group in your building, right? You're not required to do any of this. You're having the local Methodist church worship in your building. You are required to put something in at least when they start, because they are leasing the building and it is for worship. So part of this is for you. Part of this is for protection in case you get audited on whether your not-for-profit status is being used correctly or not. You are saying basically, so yes, we're leasing this building to this other religious group, and we know that they are another religious group, and so we've shown that, and yes, they are paying us this amount of money as part of that, but you're covering yourself by having this in there. Deb? You're muted. There you go.
According to the accountant on the treasurer's report, he wants us to be sure to include the previous month's income, expenses, and the closing balance on the operating account, so that month to month you have a rolling accounting of what money's being spent and what the
You can do
balance
that
is.
either, again, with the written report then that's attached, if you have such, that will show it, or you can put it in right where the comments are for the treasurer's report.
Okay.
Okay. Other things that go into your minutes. The election of elder commissioners for the presbytery, or for any, if you have somebody who's serving on the synod, etc., as well as the fact that they report what's happened there. So you're not just electing somebody, they're supposed to come back and at the next meeting also tell you what happened at those meetings if they're serving in that way. Any baptism dates, any communion dates go in your report. Your examination of new members. Examination of new members in this presbytery, I have learned, takes a whole series of different forms. All right. For some people, there are a series of questions that every new member has to answer in order to join. In others, it's let's sit down and chat about what the church is like and how we can get you involved and what you might like to do. And so that any of those are fine. All right. But you need to put in that you have somehow met with these new members. It's a chance for them to get to know the church and how it operates. Some of you will have formal processes to do that. Some of you will just do it very informal, but it needs to be. Some of you will actually know of at least a few churches where the session gives permission to a small group to actually do the examination of new members. That's fine too. As long as it's recorded in your minutes one way or the other, you can do it in any of those ways. Again, reception of new members, we've already talked about when we mentioned the role of profession of faith, baptism, reaffirmation, letter of transfer, etc. Removal of members, so you keep track of who is transferred out, who's become inactive. If you have an inactive role, you're not obligated to anymore. Anybody who has died, you keep track of. So when we do the necrology, you know who to report. Ordination dates, installation dates. So the date that not only ordinations for ministers, which we also keep track of, but the date when a ruling elder or a deacon is installed or ordained should be in your minutes as well as in your rolls and registers. Any congregational meeting time and agenda also go in your minutes because those are set by who? The session, right? So they should be in your minutes to show up that you've set them. Housing allowance for the pastoral staff needs to be in your minutes. And it needs to be ideally in your minutes, January minutes, because technically the IRS for any housing allowance says housing allowance has to be approved before it's paid out. And so if you're not approving it till March and you've been paying the regular amount, technically the pastor is obligated to report it for their January and February time. Most pastors will not. We've had one or two pastors that have gotten very upset because they feel like if they get audited, they're going to be in trouble if they don't report it for salary instead. So it's very important as soon as, for a new call, as soon as that person's there, the first month, you make sure you report it if they have a housing allowance. It's an important thing from IRS perspectives. Approval of the budget, right? That needs to be in your minutes. The budget is approved by the session, not by the congregation. Therefore, it should show up in the session minutes, not in the congregational minutes, right? And then ideally, for a lot of congregations, if you have events, a calendar of events that you may want to have on the agenda because they're things that will have impacts on future session meetings. So if there's something, well, we're having a new member welcoming gathering on this date, you may want to list that in your minutes because, oh, after that, who's going to join? We need to do a follow-up, right? Who's going to join? So events that would have an impact on future session meetings should also be listed in your calendar of events in your minutes. Just so you know how to track them and other people know that they're coming up. Questions on congregational session minutes? Okay, then we'll go on to congregational meeting minutes. The minutes of all congregational meetings go into the session record book, just like the session minutes, in chronological order, just like the session minutes. So if you've had a congregational meeting between your March and your April session meeting, that's where they go. All right. Ordinarily, the installed pastor moderates those meetings. If an installed pastor can't do it, again, they can invite another minister from the Presbytery to serve. If there's no installed pastor, COM can appoint someone to do it for you. And again, you're the secretary ordinarily of that meeting. So you take the minutes for that meeting. If you're unable to do that, the congregation can elect the secretary pro tem for that meeting. But that needs to happen right at the very beginning of the meeting. You must have minimally an annual meeting. When? It depends on your bylaws. About 2 years before COVID, when we did a bylaw review, one of the things I said is, please, 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 if you can, remove something that says, we will always have our congregational meeting on the second Sunday of the month of January, right? Because lots of things, before COVID, I would have said to you, because after all, it could snow, for instance, and nobody could get there, right? Or the reports couldn't get run off, or people couldn't get them in, or the meeting couldn't get ready because of the weather. Right? Now with COVID, that's even more the case. We need some flexibility for things that are coming along. So we will have an annual meeting in the first quarter of the year, or we will have an annual meeting, during Lent. You want something that has some flexibility that's there for yourself, so that hopefully your bylaws will give you that kind of flexibility now. If they haven't, please change them, because we've learned that it's almost impossible to guarantee that we can always have meetings at that time. Lynn, question?
Yes, just about the congregational meeting minutes that go in the record book. If we have, for example, only an annual meeting, those minutes are approved by the congregation at the next annual meeting, which is a year later. So the minutes could go into the session book without being approved?
So there are several different ways to actually have the minutes approved. You can have them approved the day of the meeting if you have them ready. You can have the congregation vote to give the session the right to approve the minutes on your behalf, or you can wait for the next year. If you've done number 1 or 2, then they would go into your book right away, right? As soon as the session has approved them on behalf of the congregation, or as soon as at the end of the meeting, they've been approved by often a clerk will stand up and just, especially if it's only like approve a change of terms of call or something, they will just read what their minutes are going to say to the congregation and ask for approval. That's fine. Either of those can go in right away. If it's not happening until the next year, then the minutes from the previous year would be going into your book at this point as the approved minutes, because you would be putting down approved at the congregational meeting on this date as part of those minutes.
Right, so they don't have to be chronological in that case.
They'd be chronological for where they're approved, when they're approved, not for the the date that the meeting happened in the third case.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. So your annual meeting, if you have special meetings of the congregation, they also need to be in there. And again, they need to spell out the business to be transacted at those special meetings, just like a special session meeting needs to be for a specific piece of business. You can't just call extra meetings that are not the annual meeting for anything else. It needs to be for specific business. To elect, to hire a new pastor, to have a congregation vote on a new installed pastor, for instance, that would be a special meeting. You need to give adequate notice. What is that? That depends on your bylaws usually. Notice must include, among other things, under a book of order, notice at the regular service of worship prior to the meeting. So you may say, your bylaws may say, we're going to email out a notice of when the meeting is. You also, if you're having a meeting, say a Sunday after church, you need to announce it at that Sunday as well. Okay. A quorum has to be there. Your congregation's bylaws should include what a quorum is. I've had in the last couple of years, especially during COVID, people tell me that their quorum number for their congregational meeting is higher than their actual number of members. All right. You need to change your quorum number. All right. If you are in the situation that I just described, I'm not going to go into detail about different ways to do that if you no longer have the number that would constitute quorum, but contact me and we will work out a way for you to make that change, because the quorum number should not be a huge number. You're not looking to have 50% or 75% of your congregation at a congregational meeting for the quorum. It'd be great if you have that number, right? But you want a fairly small amount of the people have to be there. 10%, 15%, something like that is what you're looking for. Of your, I would say, of your regular attendance. I wouldn't say of your membership, because often we have some congregations that are 400, 500, 1,000 people, and their average Sunday attendance is 200, 150, so forth. You're not going to, let's use 1,000 as a huge congregation for us. You're not going to get 800 people to come to a congregational meeting, right? If you start with, well, our average Sunday attendance is 200, you might get 40, 50, that's much more realistic, even in a large congregation. So you need to make sure you have a quorum for a congregational meeting that makes sense. Proxy voting is not permitted in church meetings in any way. We have a principle as Presbyterians that the Holy Spirit guides us in our decision making. We're not obligated, when we send commissioners to General Assembly, for instance, they're not obligated to vote by what the Presbytery thinks about something. They vote their conscience. They listen to the Holy Spirit and vote on what the Holy Spirit suggests that they should do in that time. So based on that, proxy voting is not allowed. You have to be present in the room, hear the discussion, open to the guidance of the Spirit in order to be able to vote. So no proxy voting. And that's important as we hopefully move towards being able to have hybrid meetings as well. People have to be able to hear everything going on, whether they're on virtual or whether they're on in face-to-face. And then you need to always, as clerk, be prepared for a ballot vote. What that usually means is if you're doing it on Zoom, you need to have a poll ready to set up, or you need to know how to set up a poll on Zoom if that's where you're voting. If you're face-to-face, you need to have paper ready and pencils ready for people, so that if somebody calls for a ballot vote at the congregational meeting, you can do that. And ideally, you would also have some people who are neutral on whatever issue is going to be ballot voted set up to count ballots quickly as well, because the congregation is going to be sitting there waiting for them to be counted. So those are all part of a congregational meeting's records. Now, what goes into the business of the congregational meeting? The congregational meeting's business can only include the following. This is the list that the Book of Order allows us to have. Nothing else goes before the congregation. It can elect ruling elders, deacons, nominating committee, trustees. And you must always ask for nominations from the floor. for each of those categories, always. It can call a pastor, a co-pastor, an associate pastor. It can change the pastoral relationship. That's usually what we see when we approve terms of call, for instance. It can request or consent or decline to consent to a dissolution. So if you have an installed pastor or associate pastor, then you need to have the congregation act on the dissolution of that call or the call. If you have a stated supply pastor, the congregation does not need to act on those. Somebody put their hand up, but then I don't see it anymore. So whoever that was, did you have a question? No? Okay. Real property can come before the congregation, again, because you need to approve buying, selling, or mortgaging real property. Requests to the presbytery to grant an extension on your officer term limits has to come to the congregation. That's, for instance, well, you've got somebody who served, everybody who served 6 years, you can't fill your spot without putting somebody out for a 7th year. We had this during COVID. So many times we gave a general blanket exception for people because they couldn't get a congregational meeting for that time, right? But otherwise, if you need an exception to the term limit of the 6-year consecutive term limit, you would take that to the congregational meeting, and then that would be brought to the presbytery from that. An approval for a creation of a joint witness congregation. This is a congregation where you want to join with the UCC church nearby, and you're going to share a pastor and worship together, or the RCA church nearby, or the Lutheran church. That has to be approved by the congregation itself. Or if you already have a joint witness, any amendment to that joint witness would need to be approved by the congregation itself. Don't. We still had one congregation that showed up in the minutes this way this year. Do not ask the congregation to approve the budget. Can you bring the budget to show the congregation? Yes, of course you can, for information purposes. But do not ask for votes on the budget. You can ask people who have questions, and then what happens if there are questions that are important? You bring it back to the session to deal with those questions, right? It does not get voted on, but I don't care. The person whose minutes it was in said to me, but we've always done it that way. It doesn't matter. It's nice that now you're going to say to them, no matter how you've done it before, the book of order says that's a session responsibility. And so you're going to say, we're bringing this to you for information purposes, right? And we are happy to have your comments, and we're happy to have your questions, and we will take them back to the session table and consider them. That's what you do with the budget. Any ecclesiastical and corporate business obviously gets recorded. We've already talked about what religious corporation law requires. So those also get recorded in your minutes for the congregational meeting. Generally, what you will be recording and when you move into the corporate business is that the current moderator stepped away and so took over running the meeting, whether it's you or the treasurer or however your bylaws require for your corporate officers. They will take over the meeting for that part of the business that is the religious corporation business. So for instance, for the terms of call of the pastors, the most common one that we see there. But they can both be put together in the same minutes. You do not have to have separate minutes for religious corporation actions. You just need to record that you've moved into that stage. Susan?
What's an example of an ecclesiastical
Everything,
thing?
everything except religious corporation is ecclesiastical.
Oh,
So the bulk of a congregational meeting,
right.
the session,
Okay.
is all ecclesiastical.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thought we were doing it all wrong.
No, I mean, almost always it's what's determined by the book of order versus
Right.
the state that you're living in. So anything the
Okay.
book of order requires is ecclesiastical.
Okay.